Hello, and welcome to Roundhouse Crosstalk, a podcast hosted by the California State Railroad Museum. In this week's episode, Amanda sits down with Jay Youngdahl, a labor lawyer and author, who's worked extensively with Navajo railroad workers. In this episode, we learn about what the Navajo railroad workers do for the railroad, what their history with the railroad is, and how their religious and cultural attitudes influence how they work for the railroad. It's a great interview. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I think you guys are really going to like it. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get into the show.
Well, thank you for joining me today. I'm excited to have you.
Same, excited to do it. Thanks for reaching out.
So what is the history behind Navajo men working rail maintenance? How long have they been doing that?
So the history of Native American people on the railroads are fascinating. First, think about the area geographically. So essentially what we're talking about are the railroad lines that run from California, mainly Southern California, but also Central California, the Bay Area, across the west toward Chicago, Kansas City, St. Louis, and then with goods going then on to New York and there. So there are several, three main railroad lines in North, Central, and South. The South in some way is the easiest. And so the old Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad dominated along with the Union Pacific Railroad. The Pueblo people worked for a period of time with the railroad, partially because the railroad, the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe went through some of the Pueblo reservations. But for a variety of reasons, I'm not quite sure, most of those folks did not continue to work on the railroad. That line does not go through the Navajo reservation, but it goes just a bit south of the Navajo reservation. And the Navajo reservation is really, really large, about the size of the state of West Virginia. And at the time that I was writing, there were about 250,000 people that lived there. I think there are more now. And one of the things that it's a confluence of factors, but one of them is that in the 1930s, some well-meaning but probably wrong government officials decided that there were too many sheep on the reservation, and the sheep were eating up all the grasses. And so they did this project where they killed essentially 75% of the sheep on the reservation. And women had worked with sheep, children had worked with the sheep, men had worked with the sheep. And it did all kinds of things for them, the sheep. But now those were gone, so how are you going to make a living? So folks were really pressed to do that. So there was a need of Navajo people to bring in more income. Then we have the old trading post system. And the trading post system, most of the trading posts were run by Mormon folks. And the problem for the trading posts was they wanted the Navajo people to have money because they wanted the Navajo people to buy things from them. And so they were quite happy to try to figure out ways. The railroads needed workers. And the work that the Navajo people did was on the tracks, which is the hardest, most difficult, and most dangerous parts of work on the railroad. The railroads are having a hard time getting folks to come in from other places. It's not a lot of people that live in that area. And then the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the railroad, there's a group called the Railroad Retirement Board. That's a government agency that specifically deals with all railroad workers, not just Navajo. They were having an issue. And so essentially a paternalistic triangle formed, which really didn't involve any agency from Navajo people themselves. But so the government wanted to look like it was helping the Navajo people. The trading post wanted to get more money in the reservation so they could buy more goods. The trading post owners would make more money. And the railroads needed labor, folks who would work hard and were willing to work out in desolate and difficult conditions. So those folks come together. Now, this is right after World War II. And prior to World War II, the U.S. and the railroads had gotten together, the government and the railroads had gotten together and put a program in to bring Mexican workers in. So at one point, there were 125,000 Mexican workers who were brought into the Southwest of the United States to work mainly on the railroads, some into the mines. when the war was over, there was a big fear in the country about, are there going to be enough jobs for returning veterans? And there was a huge fear about that, certainly among white workers, but black workers as well. And so all the Mexican workers were just sent back, just summarily sent back to Mexico. But then the problem for the railroads was that the folks still didn't, a lot of black and white workers still weren't all that thrilled about coming to the Southwest, especially given what the railroads wanted to pay, which was not very much. So kind of this paternalistic triangle formed, and they figured out a way to kind of do this that helped the three of them. And again, because of the level of paternalism that was going on then, they felt like they were just really helping out the Navajo people. So that's when the program started. And essentially, while the trading posts don't play the same role, the BIA does not play exactly the same role. We have a similar kind of process that still works to this day, frankly, of Navajo workers leaving the reservation. In general, they leave right after the end of winter and are often away from the reservation for 6 months. If you ever drive, like on Interstate 40, for example, through Arizona and New Mexico, it runs along the same line as the railroads. And often you'll see big gangs of people replacing railroad tracks, or there's been a derailment. Most likely that's 50 to 75% Navajo workers who are out there doing that work. Sometimes the workers go east. So there's a lot of stories, a lot of bad stories early on of Navajo workers being taken to work in, let's say, Kansas City, Wichita, and then kind of a bad boss would decide they didn't like them and just say, go home. And they didn't have cars. Navajo people didn't have a way to get home at that point. And so a lot of them, you have to go down to the bus station and just hope that somebody helps you get a bus ticket back to Albuquerque. There's a ton of stories of that kind of thing.
And how do Navajo men enter the industry? How are they recruited?
So in the old days, it was really up to the trading post owners. And so the trading post owners had huge power because they not only had the goods, but they had the jobs too. So if they didn't like a worker, they didn't think the worker was paying their bill down quick enough, they wouldn't send them to the railroad. But essentially the railroad would get news to the trading post owner that they needed a certain number of workers. And the workers generally came together in either Gallup, New Mexico, Winslow, Arizona, a couple other cities. And they would come in, and then there would often be somebody from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And at first, they were there to completely help the railroads. But then after a number of them recognized that the railroads were really not taking care of Navajo folks as they should. And so there's documents that show the Bureau of Indian Affairs kind of advocating and say a little bit for the Navajo people. They'd be brought in, and then they'd be just kind of parceled out to different railroads to do different jobs. The workers had no idea really often of where they're going, no idea how long they were going to be gone. The system now, one thing that happened on this system that's a very happy part is that in the late 60s, there was a group of lawyers that had been set up in what was called legal aid. It still exists today. And there was a legal aid group out there near the reservation, and they recognized the problems with this system, and they popularized what was going on and how bad it was for the workers, how they were being taken advantage of. And they got a lot of national publicity. And in fact, I found documents where the senator in Arizona at the time, Barry Goldwater, who later ran for president, wrote a letter to whomever was head of legal aid in Washington, D.C., just bald-faced saying, we got to get these guys out of here. We've had good relations with the Navajos before. We'll have good relations in the future, but we got to get these darn lawyers out of here because they're causing us a lot of problems. So And then the word got out to a famous journalist at the time called a muckraker named Jack Anderson. And he got information about an especially egregious story where a trading post owner had gotten into a dispute with a Navajo woman, and in fact, had pulled a knife on her and tore her shirt off. But he had this column that was read all over the United States, and so he wrote about it. And the railroads they didn't care, but it was bad for the trading posts, and it was really bad for the government officials. And so I found documents where they, after the first article, they got with Jack Anderson and said, please don't write any more stories about this. And that was raw meat to him. So he wrote another story about it on his radio show. Now in the system, most of the workers get their jobs through what are called chapter houses. So the system of governance on the Navajo reservation revolves around, I think it's around 75, I haven't looked recently, chapter houses. So they're locations spread out geographically around the reservation. The reservation includes parts, is mainly in Arizona and New Mexico, but has a little part of Utah as well. And they're kind of the social center. And they've developed over the years. And so now they have internet there, because most of the reservation does not have internet. Most of it doesn't have phone service. But you can go to the chapter house if you want to work, and you can often get on the internet and see if there's any job openings. Sometimes the railroads will send letters, and then there's a huge amount of word of mouth of this. So that's how it really works today. So,
what does this labor look like, and what makes it so dangerous?
Yeah. So in most industrial settings in the United States, there's been a process to try to regularize certain safety practices. So when I first was a young man and I worked in a oil tool factory making different parts that were used in oil fields, we would put metal into these machines, but we had to wear these straps on our hands so that when the machine came down to smash onto the metal and make it put it in shape, it would jerk our hands out of there, so our hand couldn't be in there and have it cut off. And things are even better now. There's still a lot of industrial accidents, but many of them have been eliminated because of certain safety problems. The problem with what these folks do, who work on the tracks, which is where most Navajo workers work, is that you think about a railroad track, there's been some kind of accident, derailment. Think about the tracks are kind of all flipped up in the air. There's rocks everywhere. It's often dark. You've got to get things done quickly. Sometimes it's blocking roads. And so folks get sent out there, and there's no special kind of safety gear that you can do, that you can have. You still got to do things very much in ways that were done in the past. There are things that can be done. People do a lot of stretching because the single biggest injury is bad back. So you're taught how to do that. They stretch before work. But a lot of knee problems from walking there. And the history of the railroad injuries are amazing, really. So at one point, 1 out of 50 railroad workers died every year. This is in 1907 when the first law was passed. So if you worked for the railroad for 5 years, you had a 1 in 10 chance of dying on the railroad. I think the year that the first Safety Act was passed, there were 4,500 railroad workers that died. It's 1907, and 65,000 that were injured. So this has been improved in some of the jobs on the railroad, but not on the track work. So, and in the Southwest, you have often inclement weather. It's often very high up in high desert. So sometimes you've got snow coming in, those kinds of things. It's really easy to slip, etc. And there are some better. The shoes are better, things like that. But overall, it's the same. It's the same kind of work. So most of the Navajo men that I spoke to worked at the railroad had been injured in some way at some time. Now, this class of workers are called maintenance of way. So the way is the railroad tracks, and their union is called the Brotherhood of Maintenance of Way Workers. And you may have noticed that we have, as we're speaking here today on November 14th, we have a dispute between the railroads and some of the unions about a new collective bargaining agreement. And the one that has just voted it down, what was offered to them by the railroads is the Brotherhood of Maintenance of Way Employees, the BMWE. And the main reason they voted it down is because the railroads really refused to give them much time off. That is, the railroads believe that they would rather have fewer workers working much harder and longer than have more on the job. And so these maintenance away workers said, we don't want that. We need some time off. And that's especially important for Navajo workers because even when your job is done, you still got to get back to the reservation. And then, like I said, the reservation is as big as West Virginia. So then you got to get back to your house. And in the old days, there weren't phones or that kind of thing. There wasn't even a way to tell your loved ones you're coming back or that you were hurt or any of those things. The railroads didn't set up those kinds of systems. So we still have those kinds of problems. There's also some track work that's a little more regularized. So, for example, every number of years, a track has to be replaced. And there are ways to do that are safer now than were done in the past. But it's still very, very hard work. And folks still get hurt all the time. So.
And has this labor changed the way their daily lives and communities are organized? I assume being away from home for 6 months out of the year probably changes the social structure of their communities.
It's true. There are a few female Navajo workers, but not generally who do this track work. There are some who do used to call pink or white collar work, but the railroads have worked very hard to eliminate those jobs. So you don't really see those. So again, it's a male occupation in general. The history is you've seen a number of changes come and go. For example, when people first started noticing, let's put this, when white academics first started noticing railroad work, and there was a town where a lot of railroad workers went, Ogden, Utah. So a lot of the towns in the West, including California, began as railroad towns. And so this fellow who was, in fact, he was named David Brugge, and he was a Unitarian Universalist, and he had decided to work with the railroad gangs and try to, from a religious perspective, do some things that he could help. But he noticed and he read that in Ogden, there was a big difference between the Navajo workers who had family lives back home and those that didn't. And those that did tried to make sure their money was sent back. And those that didn't often spent all their money in those things in Ogden that they may have enjoyed, whether that was good for them or not. Another question. So, and then I did in the book, I ran into one couple who, wherever the husband went, the wife and the kids went too. So, and probably that was, my belief is that was the woman decided, we're going to keep this family together. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to all go together. They did homeschooling, you might say. So there was certainly some of that. There are studies of Native American people work in other industrial areas in the West, especially in mines. And the belief is that this was a much easier job on people's family and, let's just say, existential lives, because if you went to work every day at the exact same place, you could have your family there. If your family tried to go with you on this track work, just like you were moving every day, they had to move every day, and that was very hard. The other problem, of course, is that you come back from the railroad hurt, and one of the most really outrageous parts of all my research is how the railroad would not really pay much attention to the people that got hurt on the job. And supposedly the Bureau of Indian Affairs should have helped on that, but they really didn't. So the man would come back, maybe have a little money, maybe not, and be hurt. And so the things that he would otherwise have done around the house, contributing to the family and the hard work of the wife and the kids, he couldn't do. And so that moves people into all kinds of problematic situations. You feel bad for yourself. It causes problems within the family. Sometimes it causes more drinking or whatever. There can be some issues. So it's very difficult on family life. And, you can just step out and think about yourself and say, okay, you've got your loved one, you got your family, and, one of you leaves for, could be a month, could be 8 months. You never know when they're coming back. You got to keep it together. Never know what they did while they were there. They don't know what you did. And it's tough. It's really tough. It's a tough way. But there have been, and I can't say in the last decade, but there really were very few places for Navajo men to work, and women as well. And so there was a study done of one town in Arizona on the reservation, Shonto, and 50% of the income, over 50% of the income that came into the town, considering always governmental assistance, whatever, was from railroad work for the men who left Shonto and came back. So you just didn't really have any choice in order to survive, even though it had this, very, very difficult effect on the family and often on you.
And with all this danger and all these injuries while working, why are Navajo workers less likely to receive compensation after they're injured while working on the railroad?
So there's several reasons. One is kind of an interesting one, I think, and that is that I'm a big believer that the way we all become better as people is that we look at other folks and we try to see things from their perspective. Navajo people, as a lawyer, I have to operate in this super rational, although sometimes it doesn't seem all the way, but super rationalized system. You've got these rules and this, you got to do this at this time and all this kind of stuff. And you could be anywhere. I'm in a court in New York City. I'm in a court in Sacramento. I'm in a court in Navajo. You've got these rules you got to go by, and you got time limits, and you got all this kind of stuff. Navajo culture, I'm a great respecter of Navajo culture. I've learned a whole lot from it, but time and rules in those ways are not as high up in their hit parade as they are for Anglo white males, let's just say. Now, on other matters like place, Navajo people. So, an example. So, if you have somebody's been injured and you're trying to, as a lawyer, get some money for them for the railroad, you have to show where the injury happened and when it happened. Well, when it happened, I'd say, when did it happen? Well, I don't know, it was a while back. Okay, but was it Tuesday? Was it 10 o'clock in the morning? It's like, well, I don't know. It was really hot that day, I'd say, where did it happen? Oh, well, it happened right here by this. There's this white rock. So they have a sense of place, which I don't really have. But sense of time is different. So one of the difficulties, and one of the reasons that not as many lawyers help them, is it's really hard to be successful having to do that translation of really philosophy, life philosophy, and translation in terms of language. So most of the Navajo people that I worked with, either only spoke Navajo or mainly spoke Navajo. And so you pick up, like in any culture, you pick up the words that are important. Like if you go to vacation and you're an Anglo person, you go to Spanish speaking country, you figure out what food is or beer or whatever the things are you're brewing. And Navajo people certainly picked up those things, and it's changing a lot with schools now. So there was this double translation problem. And so for a lot of lawyers, it wasn't wasn't worth it to represent the Navajo workers, especially then as well, because the reservation is so isolated. So it's hard to even meet your client. It was often hard to get in touch with your client. So that was one of the reasons. Number two is just straight up racism. So there's just, Navajo people are considered not as worthy, very similar to African Americans there's a lot of history of African Americans working on the railroad in the Southeast, and they worked over all the United States, but especially after the Civil War. And there's still a lot of records about how Black workers were treated. They had all kinds of rules. They wouldn't let them couldn't even bring a chicken in to cook because I don't know what reason. So Navajo workers were considered less than human. And I guess that goes back to the American Constitution or whatever, right? We had America's original sin is that kind of racism. That still goes on today to some degree. And then you have issues like when a person gets hurt, you're supposed to be compensated so that you can live going forward like you haven't been hurt, assuming it's not your fault. And the railroads will say, well, you don't need that much money to live on the reservation. What are you going to spend it on? It's not like New York City or California rents. You're not paying California rent prices or some of those things. And so there was this kind of feeling that they didn't need that much money. And so in any kind of injury situation, and they would, so those come together. So it's both a cultural factor that we don't necessarily see with other oppressed groups in the United States, and then the very common things we see with oppressed groups here in the United States. This is still the case today. And there's in the historical record, there's all kinds of things where the Bureau of Indian Affairs would say, there's a whole lot of people we've run into on the reservation that should have received sickness and accident benefits and haven't. And there's something where one of the officials said, well, they can't even read and write. So how would we give them any kind of benefits like that? So they were very bold. Some of these records, just as an aside, the way I found these was, like your question, I couldn't figure out how so many Navajo people came to work for the railroad. I understand some, and like a lot of governmental or corporate government agencies or corporations, the Railroad Retirement Board was consolidating. Now, the Railroad Retirement Board is a governmental agency, covers all the railroad workers, and under it is their Social Security. So railroad workers don't participate in the Social Security system. They don't participate in the unemployment insurance system. So all that comes under the Railroad Retirement Board. So there used to be a couple offices very near the Navajo reservation, but then they were shut. And so I went and tried to see if there were any records, and they're now in Chicago. And so they told me, well, we looked and we can't find anything. And so finally, then I get this call from one really wonderful librarian who says that she's looked around and she's found these boxes that were shipped up from the railroad retirement offices there in Arizona and New Mexico, and I'd be welcome to come up and look. And so I went to Chicago, spent a number of days, and found just all kinds of, they kept a lot of those, they were good record keepers. So all kinds of documents and letters and concerns and issues, and a lot of the book comes from some of that information I was able to find. And once I saw it, I said, this people should know for posterity how this works. And so I was able to use a lot of that, and so you're able to see the compensation and systems. And, part of the problem was, for example, the people, especially the Anglo people who worked in the Railroad Retirement Board, didn't speak Navajo and certainly didn't know how to write down a Navajo person's name. And so they would say, well, is this name or that name? And I put some lists in the book, and they'd say, well, we can't give some money to somebody, even if they're entitled to it, until we're sure this is the right person. And so they would end up not getting the benefits that under the law they deserved. So we saw a lot of that.
Were there other administrative issues that came up with the Railroad Retirement Board and Navajo workers?
So Navajo workers should have received unemployment benefits, but in general they did not. And again, it had to do with paternalism, had to do with the racism, had to do with the isolation, had to do with the language. Because on the railroad, the railroad pays a certain tax in to pay this unemployment insurance, for example, and it should have worked great for Navajo workers. That is, the railroad only wanted to do this work when it wasn't snow on the ground. So in the Southwest, that's 9 months a year, 8 months a year. And if the workers could have gotten some unemployment benefits during those other months, it would really, really have been helpful. But it's not. They did not, and so they certainly suffered. They certainly suffered because of that. So.
Are Navajo rail workers likely to be members of unions? Why or why not?
Almost all the Navajo workers are members of the Brotherhood of Maintenance of Way employees. The union tries hard, in my opinion, to do right by the workers. That hasn't always been the case. Certainly, there's some historical record of racism within that union early on, not mainly against Navajo workers, but against African American workers in the Southeast. But that was during the period in American history in the 1920s, and so when there was so much a revival of kind of the Confederacy, and that's when most of our Confederate statutes were put up and all this kind of thing. Now they work hard. I have a friend who is the union representative for the Southwest for the Brotherhood of Maintenance of Way, and he and I talk quite a bit about. I try to give him whatever assistance I can give in terms of culture or language, and he's trying hard. There still is the problem of isolation. So, for example, you worked on the railroad, and the union would says, let's have a meeting of all the workers and talk about what our problems are and what we can do. A lot of them say, well, I live 120 miles away. Gas is, $5 a gallon or whatever it is now, and I can't afford it. I'm hoping that will change when finally there gets to be good internet on the reservation. Still not there. It may be coming as part of President Biden's Industrial Recovery Act. I'm not sure. I think that would make it have a Zoom call, Zoom union meetings. They happen some in other parts of the United States. So it's a problem. But I think that at this point, while there certainly are some personal attitudes that could use improvement, the union as a whole works hard to make sure that Navajo workers are treated fairly. And now there are a few Navajo workers who work in some other crafts, such as engineer on a train, or it's called a trainman. So we're seeing some of those, especially as more and more Navajo people go through high school, go to college now, some things. And so they've been agitated for, as they should, and been able to get some of the more higher paying jobs in some of the other crafts.
And now I'd like to pivot the conversation a little bit more towards religion. What is the relationship between religion and work for Navajo rail workers?
So when I took my academic sabbatical and went to divinity school, the question I was thinking about, it sounds a little hokey, I guess, but is why be good? That is, why should a person be good? So when I grew up in the American South, the idea was because God said it was so. And Jesus and the Ten Commandments and Jewish religion had holy books and these kinds of things. And that religion, Abrahamic religions were big. And, Arkansas grew up white Arkansans, black Arkansans, and Jewish folks with Abrahamic religion as well. But now that's not there as much. And so why should it be good? I mean, it feels good, but why does it feel good? So when I was in divinity school, I tried to find anchors or resources that different cultures used on this. And I found one for sure with Navajo people. And so Navajo people have and again, let me just preface this, the best thing, the most important thing for somebody who studies another people is to express your humility at the first, in the middle, and at the end, because you can't speak for another people, but you can try to be honest about what you see. And then if you're not right, somebody will hopefully correct you. So in terms of studying Navajo religion, I tried to read what everybody had written. And there are some really great Navajo scholars about that, but there's a holistic view of life. So as I talked earlier, Navajo people have this relationship to the earth, to place, that's different, I would say, than white Anglo-Americans. But the way you're healthy is that you're in concert with the earth and all living things. So it's a very ecological view. It's a very kind and humanistic view. And so you want to balance, but you can only have that balance if you have if you're balanced with all the different factors, sentient beings, the earth, etc. So one of the big worries is what happens if you get out of balance? And so I'll talk about that in a second in terms of some of the ceremonies. But the concept that Navajo people use is called hoshong, and it is the sense of balance, because if you're balanced, you have a beauty, and that beauty then makes you even more imbalanced, because there's the beauty of the land, there's the beauty of the other people, there's the beauty of the relationships, and we don't really have good words, frankly, in English, in my opinion, to translate it well. It kind of can be described, but there's a funny story about somebody said, well, Navajos seem like really religious people, so what's their word for religion? And they said religion, because they don't really think of it as a separate concept. It's just part of your life, right? If you can live in that kind of way, then you can have the best life that you can have. You can have. Now, how do you do that? Well, one of the ways is that if you feel like you're out of balance, then you have to get into balance, and you get into balance with what we would call religious practices, religious ceremonies. And so that was one. So when the Navajo railroad workers left the reservation, they would come back as the winter was starting. They would almost always have a ceremony, which essentially the belief was they had gotten out of balance by being away from the reservation, being away from the place. Some said by being in relation to white people. And you had to have the ceremony in order to kind of clean that off. That they wouldn't say that, those kinds of words. That's kind of how it seemed like to me. And then they were kind of back in balance. Things were beautiful again, and they were in better shape. So they have a number of different ceremonies, but also as one man said to me, I think there's one God, but I think the God can come through any kind of thing, can come through Christianity, can come through our ceremonies, The Native American church, also known as the Peyote Church, is big there now. It's not so big among railroad workers, really, because they drug test you all the time. So you're not going to be taking peyote out on the job. And even now, you know how some people want to change their luck at the casinos. There's some of that. So, and especially I had one of the stories in the book is about a family whose son was going to Iraq, was in the military, was going to Iraq. And so they essentially did all four of those things in order to try to protect him. Went to Christian churches, did Navajo ceremonies, did the peyote ceremony, and then lost a few dollars at the casino too to try to do that. So, so it's all encompassing, but it's not thought of as a separate thing. So when I was a kid, we would think of, well, okay, Sunday morning, that's when you go to church or something. And maybe if you're in the youth group and you wanted to meet other kids, you went Wednesday night or something. But that was pretty much all you didn't think about a whole lot. So some people did. And certainly in bad circumstances, you did. But it was kind of, it was like a planet. I mean, it was like a moon going around you and you were the earth or something. Well, for Navajo people, it's part of the earth. It's part of the whole thing. And there's also a very fascinating creation story, which is different people interpret a little differently, I suppose, like any kind of creation story. But the creation of the Navajo people under that story, the folks came from the center of the earth and moved kind of from the bottom on the way up until they got out on the surface of our planet, I think I should say. So again, if you're close to where the ancient people came out, then you're more likely to be in balance.
And what is the blessing way?
So the Navajo folks have a lot of different traditional, we would call them rituals. And they are kind of like certain Protestant churches in the United States. They depend somewhat on the particular minister. So, you'll be in an area and you'll see all these different churches and you'll think, gosh, how are they all that different? Some of them are just different because of their history, where they came from, but a lot of it's different because of the particular minister and how she or he preaches whatever their particular gospel is. So the same kind of thing on the Navajo reservation, you have to be a person who can perform a ceremony, but it's not something that you go down to the courthouse and get your license, or even there's a certain school. It's you essentially mentor. You have a mentor, and the mentor teaches you. And then there are certain, like any religion, there are certain items that you use in these ceremonies. And the most important one is called the blessing way. And the idea, going back to Hoshan and balance, is that if you're in that right state, there's kind of one person called it a positive electricity within you. And that electricity is essentially your life-giving force. So, and the blessing way ceremony is often revolves around your hogan. And the hogan is often a circular building. It's been made out of different things over the years. Now a lot of them are made with old railroad ties, frankly, because of the importance of the railroad. And that is often the center of the blessings that one would have in life. That's where you're with your family. That's where your child is often born. That's where when you have crops or you're able to bring in or food, that's where the food stays. That's when you're old age, that's where you normally say. So it's around that structure. A family will often have a blessing way, a ceremony done for an individual person. So it may be that somebody's sick, or it may be an important thing like before you're going to get married, or something you're concerned about. You're about to go to the military, or somebody's getting ready to go away to school and you're going all the way to California. to go to school or something, and a person gets quote unquote sung over. So a medicine man will be employed, and it's often you start at sunset and you go through the night, through the next day, and into the next morning. So it's a 2-day. There's singing, there is praying, and it's to some degree kind of a recreation of your world. So it's taking away those things that have lost you balance, and it's putting you in a situation where you can kind of recreate the purity that maybe was there when you first came into the world. Corn is huge on the Navajo reservation, so corn pollen is huge. The corn pollen tassels are big. So, and then at the end of it, first you're pretty tired, but then you have a big a ceremony and eat and have a good time and this kind of thing. So we see those a lot, and these are one of the kind of ceremonies. It's the most important one, but there's also, and some people call this a kind of a curing rite or curing ritual. There are also ceremonies for divination. So you're trying to figure out what you should do in a certain situation. Kind of look into the future. So and there are different healers have different objects that they use for that. One form is a kind of hand trembling, which you see in some cultures where when you are at a place or around a person, the healer will see his or her hand trembles in a certain place. And then one funny story a guy said to me is, I use a crystal. He says, it's like your computer. He says, I can look in that crystal. I can see, just like you have to go to Google and figure out what's going to happen with Google. So those are other kinds of ceremonies. But blessing away is the most important. And it's a beautiful, beautiful.
And has the Navajo relationship to the natural landscape changed due to rail labor or rail construction?
I wouldn't say so. I think that because the tracks are all off the reservation, I think a lot of people see it as just, they would rather not leave the reservation, frankly, a lot of folks. I mean, there's a lot of Navajo people live off, and some live half on and half off. And some, I went last month and went to visit some of the people I'd interviewed, and they had lived, one guy had lived in Albuquerque when I'd interviewed him, but now he'd moved back to the reservation. And so I think that it's kind of seeing it as being, you've got to leave because you have to kind of make a living. You'd rather not leave, but when you come back, it's like you'd have left in any other kind of situation, whether to go to the military, go to school, go to train to be a nurse or whatever you want to train to be, and then you would come back. So I think there's still an extraordinary love for the reservation and the folks that live there. And there's a lot of different cultures that come through. I mean, the goth culture got really big for teenagers for a while. Yeah. And it's still, you drive around the reservation, you see teenagers dressed in all black because somehow they learned about goth stuff. So you see this, it's one of the wonderful things that I like about dealing with folks who are different than me, is just to see the mixture of, what you choose to take from the world at large and what you choose to, keep yourself in and reject in the world at large. And you see that just in any kinds of people, and you see it with Navajo people as well. So.
Great. And what is the main thing you hope our listeners take away from our conversation today?
Well, I saw that, you got a beautiful podcast, and I saw that your logo was "Our Lives Are Made of Railroad Stories." So I think that fits here. So I think for me, and it's one of the things when I get into a topic, I like to try to figure out the different aspects of it and then figure out how the aspects come together I work as an artist now, and I'm working on a Native American area, former Native American area in Florida, but it was a mangrove preserve. So we've got biologic issues and got water issues, got Native American issues, development issues, and all that. And certainly the Navajo people have that, and certainly you see that on the railroad. So is to see the kind of all the different factors that come into this group. And, folks, in my opinion, don't pay as much attention to kind of the reality of the beauty of Native American life and what we've really should learn and have learned, maybe don't realize we've learned from that. Also, for me, it's, again, the Navajo people are so generous with their time, and all the folks were happy to talk to me. But I think even more since I wrote the book, there's this degree of separation now that, well, I'm a this and you're a that, and I'm a this and you're a that. And it's really, and we see that a lot. So see it in Los Angeles this week. But we're all kind of people, and some have been dealt a better hand and some have been dealt a worse hand. And we got to recognize that. We can't ignore that. But we can learn so much from people who are different than ourselves if we start from their vantage point and think about it. It's to walk in their shoes type of thing. The second is, most people in our country are pretty darn anxious right now. And I don't think of Navajo people as being very anxious, right? How do you find existential peace? It's hard. I mean, 40% of people in the United States use some kind of a SSRI, Prozac, or something like that, antidepressant thing. And so the Navajo people have a really beautiful system, holistic system for dealing with existential peace in their lives. And, maybe it's a little bit like Buddhist meditation. Maybe it's not. We could talk about that. But it's similar to the kind of holistic life where you think about your whole life in that way. And then finally, just to get to the economics, it shows how capitalism works. It's the system we live under is there's more talk about capitalism now, and maybe we're looking at it with a little more close eye, just the system itself. But here's how the system dealt with one group of people, and they had no agency. And, maybe there were some good-hearted people, maybe there weren't, but that's the way the system deals, because it was all about really profit for the railroads, profit for the folks at the trading posts, and allowing the government officials to say they've done something so they can move up, get a better salary, get a better job, all that kind of thing. And, maybe we should think a little differently about that. And maybe this is an example of one way it operates that maybe we hadn't thought about.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us today on the podcast. Really enjoyed having you. I think this was an amazing conversation.
Well, I really appreciate it. I think you're doing a great job. The railroad is so important to the history of the United States. And I really like you've had those podcasts about the Psalms and things.
Yeah.
Cool stuff. So anyway, so thank you for all that you do.
Thank you all for listening to Roundhouse Crosstalk, a podcast hosted by the California State Railroad Museum. If you enjoyed this topic and you'd like to learn more about Navajo Railroad workers, there are two great places to start. The first is with Jay Youngdahl's book. There's a link in the description below. The second is with a video up on our YouTube page where we interview Jay Youngdahl again to learn a little bit more about Navajo Railroad workers. Thank you again for listening, and we'll see you next time.